In this video, I will show you exactly how I design my food forest step by step in a way that is so simple you could start this weekend with a handful of plants. Then at the end, I will walk you through a real guild that I planted several months ago so you can see exactly how it all comes together. Now, before I show you the step by step, there is one simple mindset shift that will make this whole process way easier. If you've gone down the food forest rabbit hole, you probably know this feeling. You start off with like a fruit tree, and then suddenly, before you know it, you're neck deep in YouTube videos, you're mapping out sun angles, you're reading your third book, and you're building a plant spreadsheet, just trying to figure out like what fixes nitrogen, what attracts pollinators, what goes where, and next thing you know, you've got a pile of notes but no plants in the ground. And that's because you are trying to design an entire forest, and every decision that you make feels like it messes up 10 others. And weirdly, the more you try to plan the perfect food forest, the harder it gets to actually start one. But what if you stopped trying to design a whole forest at once and instead just planted one small guild? Each one is started when you've got the time, the energy, and a few plants on hand. And each guild is essentially like a mini food forest. You plant one, you learn from it, and you build the next one better. And it really can be that simple. You take a main tree, usually like a fruit or a nut tree, and you surround it with a few supporting plants that will help it grow better. Now, some of those plants bring in pollinators. Some of those plants make mulch. Some fix nitrogen. Some just cover the soil and keep weeds down. And each one has a job, and they're stacked in layers, from the tall trees to the small plants down to the ground covers. Now, here's the part that most people overcomplicate. You don't need all the layers. You don't need a perfect combination, and you can literally start simply with what you've got. Take this guild for example. We planted it just a couple of months ago around this pear tree that was already here. So we planted some ground covers, some shrubs, some berries, some nitrogen fixers and biomass producers. Like anything we were able to get from seeds or cuttings at the time. Now, is this the perfect guild? No, but you know what? It doesn't matter. At first, it doesn't look like much. It's missing still a couple of key layers. It's still missing some plants, but over time we'll keep adding to it. We've already got new seeds and cuttings growing at home, and once planting season starts again, we will be ready to add more plants, more diversity and more function. Eventually, this little patch turns into a mini food forest on its own. And once it's going strong, we plant another one and then another one. And then little by little, those guilds will start to connect until what you've got is one big thriving system. And that is the power of the one guild method. You don't have to figure out everything before you start. You don't have to get it right on day one. You just start small with what you've got. Now, sure, you will want a rough idea of where to place your guilds, like how many can you fit on your land? What are the wind and the sun doing on the land? But it's simple, practical stuff, and nothing that really should keep you stuck. Because at the end of the day, this whole process is just about planting these little plant teams over time and letting them grow together. And that's the big idea behind the one guild food forest. And I've written about this in more detail in our guide, which you can download below. But now that you've got the big picture, let me walk you through how I actually design a guild step by step, so you can repeat the process with whatever plants that you've got access to and build your food forest one patch at a time. Now, this works whether you already have some trees in the ground or you're just starting with bare land. The process stays the same. And here's how it works. We always start with the tallest, longest living tree first. That's the main canopy tree, and it's the center of the guild, because that tree is going to have the biggest impact over time. It's going to create the most shade, it takes up the most space, and it sticks around the longest. So we choose that tree first and then build the rest of the guild around it. From there, we move down through the layers. So we then have the smaller trees, the shrubs, then the herbs, the ground covers, the vines, and the rest. Top down, always. That way, everything fits together naturally without overcrowding or competition later on. Now, here's the next key. Every food forest needs two types of plants. The takers, which are the ones that we like to eat, like the fruit and nut trees, and the givers, which are the support species, like excuse me, the nitrogen fixes, the biomass plants that we can chop and drop and use as a built-in compost and mulch system. They pave the way for the productive species, and in every layer we want to include both. Now here's the thing most people don't realize, and I used to make this mistake in the beginning as well. In the early years, the support species are actually more important than the fruit trees. They help fill up the space fast, they provide nutrients, they shelter the young fruit trees, and we can chop them and drop them anytime for mulch, which means that I'm not buying any compost or bringing in wood chips every season anymore. And the goal is to grow everything that the system needs right here on site. And then once the fruit trees start getting bigger and stronger, the support plants have done their job. At that point, we can cut them out, we can compost them, or we let them fade away. In fact, when starting out, it is totally possible to plant 10 support species for every productive species just to get the system going. And over time, that ratio flips until you've got mostly productive plants and just a few helpers left. But of course, these are not rules set in stone. And if you only have a handful of support species for every producer, it is still fine. The goal is to get a momentum and plant what you've got and add to it over time. So now that we've got the overview, let's jump into designing the first step, and that is choosing and placing your canopy tree. Now, I usually sketch this out by hand with just a piece of paper and a pencil, nothing fancy. But to make it easier to follow, I will walk you through it here on the computer. So in this first step, what I want to do is pick the main large tree. This is the one that will sit at the center of the guild and shape everything else around it. So let's say I'm going with something like a chestnut, but it could be literally anything that suits your climate or land size. It could be an apple tree, it could be a mango, a pecan, like whatever you want to have in your food forest and it grows well in your conditions. If you only have a small land, you might skip the tallest tree and your canopy could in fact be a subcanopy species, something like a peach tree or a hazelnut. Now, once we've decided which tree to build the guild around, we need to look up its mature width. This is important because I want to make sure it has enough space to reach its full potential, but I also want to be sure that the other plants that I'm going to add later on don't get crowded out. So if anything is fighting for space and light, the whole system will underperform. Now, a quick search on the internet will tell me that a mature chestnut spreads to about 10 meters wide. And all I have to do right now is draw a circle that represents that size. It doesn't need to be perfect, but close enough to give me a sense of scale. Once I have this circle that represents my main tree, at this point, I like to draw a straight line through the middle of the circle to mark north and south. This will help me visualize how the sun moves across this area. The sun rises in the east, moves across the south and sets in the west, which means the southern side of the tree will get the most sun and the northern side will be shadier, especially as the tree matures. Mind you, this is in the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, it is the exact opposite. And doing this helps us later on when we choose species for the other layers. Sun-loving plants can go on the southern side and the more shade-tolerant species can be placed on the north. Now, before we move on to the next layer, I like to add a couple of support species from the same canopy level. These are temporary trees I plant early on to help kickstart the system. You don't need to draw them to scale because they won't be there long term and we won't allow them to reach their mature stage. Their job is simply to grow fast, fill up the space, protect the soil and provide mulch and support to the main tree. Over time, we just keep pruning these support species and chopping them and dropping them in place until they've done their job. Now, some great support species for this layer include black locust. You just got to watch out for the thorn. Alders, you've got tipuana, ice cream bean, mimosas, acacias, anything that grows fast, puts on a lot of biomass and handles aggressive pruning. You can even use plants like figs or mulberries as support trees for biomass. They are super easy to grow from cuttings, so you can pretty much get a lot of them for free and use them as sacrificial species. If there's one thing that I've learned over the years is that you can't really overdo it with the support species early on. It's always better to have more than not enough. And that's basically it for the canopy layer. At this point, we've got one productive tree, a couple of support trees nearby, and the sun orientation is clearly marked. So we know exactly where the sunny and the shady spots will be. With that in place, we can now move on to the next layer, which is the subcanopy layer. And these are either small trees or very large shrubs. These plants can grow just under or beside the canopy layer plants without getting completely shaded out. In this example, I'm going to place 4 species in this layer, but don't get too hung up on this. I could have chosen 3, 5, 6, like whatever. Every guild is different and unique depending on the goals and location on the property. So you can really get creative here. Now, for me, I'm on the southern side, I'm going to pick something like a pomegranate and a peach, which are both sun lovers. On the northern side, I'm going to add an elderberry and a serviceberry, which both are a bit more shade tolerant. Now, just like before, the first thing I do is look up the mature width of each tree. This will help me figure out how far apart to space them. Then I simply start placing them around the main canopy tree, making sure that their canopies are just barely touching or overlapping no more than like 10 to 30%. This gives them plenty of room to grow and still lets in light and airflow for the layers below them. If I place them too close together, they will end up stretching for sunlight and they will grow tall and leggy, and most of the fruits will grow on the tips of the tree where it's very hard to reach them and ultimately reduces the production. Now, as a general rule, in warmer climates you can plant things a little bit closer together and still get good yields. In colder climates, the spacing needs to be a little bit looser, otherwise they will have more struggles to produce. So I spaced these 4 trees based on their mature size and their sun needs. Once those productive species are in place, I move on to adding a few support species from this same layer. Again, these are not permanently there, but they're just there planted to help in the early years. Some good examples for this layer could include things like pigeon pea, Siberian pea shrub, albizia trees, tree lucernes, and lots of other fast-growing chop and drop plants. Now, for these support species, I don't bother being too precise. I don't even make them to scale, and I can just drop them in wherever there is a space between and around the main trees, knowing that I'll be pruning them hard and composting them in place. These are also going to be phased out once the productive trees take over. And that's it for the subcanopy layer. We've got the 4 productive small trees or large shrubs, space for maturity and sunlight, and a handful of fast growing support plants to kickstart the system. Once that is done, I'm now ready to move on to the next layer, which is the shrub layer. In this layer, we're going to start adding the plants that can be quite productive in the early stages of the food forest, but they don't take up a lot of space. So think of things like currants, gooseberries, raspberries, blackberries, or even smaller herbs like lavender and rosemary. Now, one big tip I've learned the hard way is for this layer, you do want to leave some space to move around. When all these plants start growing, fruiting, and growing wild, basically, you're going to need some space to walk around, harvest, prune, and do some basic tasks. If you cram in every single gap with a plant, it will look lush, but it will become a logistical nightmare later on. So here's how I actually lay this out. I can place some gooseberries just south of the peach, a couple of raspberries near the inner part of the guild where I've left a little bit of space to walk through, maybe lavender and rosemary on the sunny outer edges. They like it dry and they bring in the pollinators, and something like black currants and red currants on the northern shadier side where they can still produce well. I don't overthink it, but I do make sure that each plant has the room and light it needs, and that I'm not going to regret the layout later on when everything is in full size. Some shrubs actually do really well if you overlap the canopies just below the trees, as long as there's a bit of light coming through. I've had great results planting berry bushes on their open canopy trees like figs or cherries, especially when I prune the lower branches to let more sunlight in. So don't feel boxed in. You can get creative with placement and adapt these principles and placement and plant selections in a million different ways to fit your climate and with the plants that you would like to grow. There's no one size fits all here. Every guild will look a little bit different, and as long as you keep the mature spacing and sun requirements in mind, you really can't mess this up, all right? So then we move on to the next layers, and this is where I do things a little bit differently, and I call these layers the easy layers, which are basically everything else. This is an important step because we want to avoid getting to a stage where we start overplanting like every single plant and fall into the trap of analysis paralysis. And this is usually where I personally stop planning stuff out entirely. At this point, we've got the big pieces in place. We have the main tree, the smaller trees, and the shrubs around them. Basically, that's the whole structure of the guild. Now, if we were going by the textbook 7-layer food forest model, we would still have to map out the herbs, the ground covers, the root crops and the vines. But honestly, I don't bother with this unless I'm making a design for a client and they really would like to see everything on paper. I just don't go that far. And I explain this more in the One Guild Food Forest guide, which you can download below. But essentially, this is where it gets easier. The trees and shrubs are kind of the hardest part and the longest term elements that require a little bit of planning. The rest is just a matter of filling in the gaps. So instead of stressing about exactly where to put every little herb or ground cover, I just walk around the guild once the big stuff is planted. I look for sunlight and space, which in the beginning is a lot, and I simply plant into that. That's it. You could get super detailed if you want, for sure, but in the early stages there's always plenty of room and light, and you don't have to make it unnecessarily overcomplicated for yourself. You can just plant these smaller plants wherever it feels like you want to plant them and just go for it. I just keep in mind to leave some pathways and mix things up by planting flowers for pollinators, edible plants, pest repellents, biomass plants, and so on. In the first year or two, I also always plant a bunch of vegetables too, just to get some food going while the rest of the system is slowly starting up. Doing it this way is honestly kind of freeing because you get to start quite quickly, you learn by doing, and you can adapt as you go. And that is how I design a guild from start to finish. Once you've done one of these, you will see how easy it is to replicate it. You can just keep repeating the same process, guild after guild after guild. Some of these guilds are focused on long-term support species, others are built around a fruit or nut tree. And over time, as you keep adding guilds on your land, they will start to connect, and that's when your food forest really comes alive. This approach will allow you to simply start with a handful of plants rather than thinking about the complex, mature, perfect food forest that you have in mind, and get started planting this weekend. Now, if you have more plants, go ahead and start like 2 or 3 or even more guilds. Of course, the more you start with, the better it is, because with more plants you will have more shade, it will provide more diversity, more microclimates and protection from the sun and wind. But if all you have time for is a few plants and a couple of hours to get it into the ground, start there. Even a half-built guild will always outperform a perfect food forest that lives on paper. Now, let me quickly show you a real-life example of an incomplete guild that I planted several months ago. I just used the plants that I had on hand at the time, and it's far from perfect, but that's the beauty of it. Alright, so here's a guild that I planted a couple of months ago. Now, is it finished or perfect? Not at all. I just used the plants that I had at the time. So this guild was planted around this pear tree. We've got some yacons growing in here, which is a wonderful edible root crop and will provide a lot of organic matter that we can use as mulch as we harvest the roots. Here we have a banana in the herbaceous layer. We've got some Cana indica, which has edible roots, but I personally use it mostly as biomass mulch. This stuff is growing everywhere where I live, so I can pretty much grab as many as I want from this plant and just plant it everywhere in the food forest. I've got some pineapple sage, some herbs, some flowers, and we even got some melons, butternuts, some calendula, some long-term nitrogen fixers. There's like really a whole bunch of different plants from the different layers all growing here at the same time. And honestly, apart from maybe 1 or 2 plants, everything is collected locally that I could find or started from seed, and only a few plants are bought from a nursery. And this is more than enough to get started. Now, is it perfect and will all of it work? Probably not, but that's not the point. You know, One of the things and the biggest mistakes I see people make is waiting until they figured everything out, like the perfect species, the perfect spacing, the full plant list, like the entire design. But here's the thing, you don't need thousands of plants to start your food forest. Even this half-built guild is already doing its job. It's improving the soil, it's creating microclimates, it's going to provide us with some food, and it's going to give me feedback that I would have never gotten by just planning on paper. And when you start small like this with just a few plants, you'll very quickly learn like what will thrive, what needs adjusting, and what makes sense for your land. If you've planted something that doesn't make it, so be it. Chop it down and it now becomes compost. If you've planted things a little bit too close, can happen. You know what? Just transplant it and do it better with your next guild. Start with one tree, add a couple of helpers, put in a few shrubs and just keep building around it over time. Each one of these guilds is a mini food forest, and the more guilds that you plant over time, the bigger, the more diverse and more productive your food forest will become. So at this point, you know exactly how to design your first guild and how you can repeat that process. But you're also probably thinking like, geez, that's quite a few plants that I'm going to need to establish my food forest. And well, you're not wrong. Over time, a food forest requires hundreds, if not thousands of plants. And unless money isn't the problem, buying all these plants simply isn't possible. Well, luckily for us, getting a near unlimited supply of plants for your food forest without buying everything from local nurseries is actually easier than you may think. And if you want an unlimited supply of plants for your food forest, make sure to watch this video next, and I will show you 5 simple methods that I use to get a steady flow of plants at the fraction of the cost.